Ghana, the Autobiography of Kwame Nkrumah. Preface. In 1934, when I applied to the Dean for admission to Lincoln University, I quoted from Tennyson's In Memoriam. So many worlds, so much to do, so little done, such things to be. This was to me then, as it still is today, an inspiration and a spur. It fired within me a determination to equip myself for the service of my country. When I wrote that letter, however, I little knew that it would take 10 years in America and 2.5 years in England, living almost as an exile, to prepare for the struggle that has so far engaged me and which, after nearly 8 years, has almost been won. Those years in America and England were years of sorrow and loneliness, poverty and hard work. But I have never regretted them because the background that they provided has helped me to formulate my philosophy of life and politics. At the end of my student days in America, I was offered lectureships in several Negro universities, including Lincoln. This was certainly tempting. It promised an end to my struggle for existence, a pleasurable life without worry, in an atmosphere that I had long felt to be a part of me. But I could not dismiss from my mind, in a matter of a few days, the flame of nationalism that had been fanned and kept alight for over 10 years. Independence for the Gold Coast was my aim. It was a colony, and I have always regarded colonialism as the policy by which a foreign power binds territories to herself by political ties with the primary object of promoting her own economic advantage. No one need be surprised if this system has led to disturbances and political tension in many territories. There are few people who would not rid themselves of such domination if they could. At this time, I devoted much energy to the study of revolutionaries and their methods. Those who interested me most were Hannibal, Cromwell, Napoleon, Lenin, Mazzini, Gandhi, Mussolini, and Hitler. I found much of value to be gleaned and many ideas that were useful to me later in my own campaign against imperialism. At first, I could not understand how Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence could possibly be effective. It seemed to me to be utterly feeble and without hope of success. The solution of the colonial problem, as I saw it at that time, lay in armed rebellion. How is it possible, I asked myself, for a revolution to succeed without arms and ammunition? After months of studying Gandhi's policy and watching the effect it had, I began to see that when backed by a strong political organization, it could be the solution to the colonial problem. In Jawaharlal Nehru's rise to power, I recognized the success of one who, pledged to socialism, was able to interpret Gandhi's philosophy in practical terms. The Gold Coast revolt against colonialism is not a new thing. Its roots are deep. There was a confederation of 1868 when certain chiefs came together to defend themselves not only against their tribal kin, the Ashantis, but also against political encroachments from abroad. After the Bond of 1844, which gave Britain trading rights, the Gold Coast had come increasingly under her control. The next great move of political cohesion and conscience was the formation of the Aborigines Rights Protection Society by chiefs and literate Africans with the object of defending Gold Coast land. When this collapsed because of an ever-widening rift between the chiefs and the educated people, the latter, binding themselves together, supported by their educated brothers in other West African territories, established the National Congress of British West Africa. This was the first indication of West African nationalism. However, because it lacked the support of the masses, it disintegrated in 1930. The vacuum that this left in Gold Coast politics was eventually filled by the formation of the United Gold Coast Convention by the merchant and lawyer class of the country. It was when I realized that this movement was doomed to failure because it ignored the interests of the masses that I broke away in 1949 and formed the Convention People's Party. I saw that the whole solution to this problem lay in political freedom for our people, for it is only when people are politically free that other races can give them the respect that is due to them. It is impossible to talk of equality of races in any other terms. No people without a government of its own can expect to be treated on the same level as peoples of independent sovereign states. It is far better to be free to govern or misgovern yourself than to be governed by anyone else. The formation of the CPP coincided with a political awakening among the workers and young people of the country. Ex-servicemen who had taken part in the 1939 World War returned to the Gold Coast dissatisfied with their position after having been given the chance of comparing their lot with that of other peoples, and they were prepared to take any line which would better their conditions. There was a general dissatisfaction with the British colonial policy that had been adopted until that time, especially the policy of indirect rule, which so encouraged tribal feudalism. Again, the Russian Revolution and its aftermath had left its mark by spreading ideas of workers' solidarity, trade union movements, freedom, and independence. Events in Asia also added a glow to the political awakening. The CPP was not merely a mass movement. Mass movements are well and good, but they cannot act with purpose unless they are led and guided by a vanguard political party. And when the time comes for a ruling power to accord self-government, it will do so more willingly if it can hand over to a properly constituted political party with a majority backing, rather than to a revolutionary nationalist movement. Rallying around me all those who genuinely wished for progress, I resisted both the opportunist element and the reactionary forces, and sought to establish the CPP as the democratic instrument of the people's will and aspirations. We were freely elected to power in 1951. 3 years later, and again in 1956, the same confidence was shown by the country. The first objective, then, is political independence, for which I believe the organization itself must take two forms. First, there is the period of positive action, a combination of non-violent methods with effective and disciplined political action. At this stage, open conflict with the existing colonial regime is inevitable, and this is a test of strength for the organization. Since it is marked by non-violence, and since the forces of might are on the side of colonial power, there is little chance of complete success in this period. The second stage is one of tactical action, a sort of contest of wits. From now on, the movement must take its ideology clear and convincing. The ideology of my party must be formulated as follows. No race, no people, no nation can exist freely and be respected at home and abroad without political freedom. Once this freedom is gained, a greater task comes into view. All dependent territories are backward in education, in agriculture, and in industry. The economic independence that should follow and maintain political independence demands every effort from the people, a total mobilization of brain and manpower resources. What other countries have taken 300 years or more to achieve, a once dependent territory must try to accomplish in a generation if it is to survive. Unless it is, as it were, jet propelled, it will lag behind and thus risk everything for which it has fought. Capitalism is too complicated a system for a newly independent nation. Hence the need for a socialistic society. But even a system based on social justice and a democratic constitution may need backing up during the period following independence by emergency measures of a totalitarian kind. Without discipline, true freedom cannot survive. In any event, the base must be loyal. A loyal, honest, hardworking, and responsible civil service on which the party in power can rely. Armed forces must also be consolidated for defense. In this way, self-government was won for the Gold Coast. Its independence will be complete, however, unless it is linked up with the liberation of other territories in Africa. Ghana now joins the independent states of Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, Libya, Morocco, the Sudan, Tunisia, and elsewhere the continent is ruled by no less than 6 European powers. Our example must inspire and strengthen those who are still under foreign domination. In this belief, I have written the story of my life so far. If in any way it helps the cause of freedom, it will have served its purpose. Kwame Nkrumah, from Accra, October 1956. Chapter 1. Birth and Early Childhood. The only certain facts about my birth appear to be that I was born in the village of Kruful in Nzima around midday on a Saturday in mid-September. Nzima lies in the extreme southwest of the Gold Coast and covers an area of about 1,000 square miles stretching from the river Ankobra on the east to the river Tano and its lagoons on the west. It has a population of about 100,000 people and was known to Europeans for many years as Apollonia because it was only on the feast day of Saint Apollo that a white man first set foot in Nzima land. In the outlying areas of the Gold Coast, nobody bothered to record the dates of births, marriages, and deaths, as is the custom of the Western world. Such happenings were remarkable only because they provided a cause for celebration. By tribal custom, it was enough for a mother to assess the age of her child by calculating the number of national festivals that had been celebrated since its birth. In most cases, however, even this was unknown, as nobody was concerned very much with age. Time did not count in those peaceful communities. The national festival of Nzima is called Kuntum. According to my mother's calculations, 45 Kuntums have taken place since I was born, which makes the year of my birth 1912. On the other hand, the priest who later baptized me into the Roman Catholic Church recorded my birth date as the 21st of September 1909, although this was a mere guess on his part. I have always used this date on official documents, not so much because I believed in its accuracy, but insofar as officialdom was concerned, it was the line of least resistance. It was not until recently that I came to realize how near the mark this guess must have been. For recently, I spent a short holiday in Nzima and had the opportunity to revisit some of my childhood haunts and to recapture the past. As I sat with some friends on the seashore at Harfasini, our eyes were drawn to the rusty bulk of the Bacana, a cargo boat owned by the British and African Steam Navigation Company, which had been wrecked in 1913 and had come to rest on the seashore. The Bacana had been a hallmark to me for so long that I had never realized how significant a part it could play in throwing light on my age. One of my friends asked me what had happened and whether I could remember it. Although I was certainly no older than 3 or 4 years at the time, I can well remember being told the story of this disaster. On the night of the 27th of August, 1913, the Bacana, on her way back from Nigeria to the United Kingdom with a cargo of oil, got into difficulties in a particularly heavy surf between Dick's Cove and Half Assini. In spite of the efforts of the captain to turn the ship seawards, the Bacana was dragged by a strong current nearer and nearer the shallow water until she got her propeller embedded in about 5 feet of sand. 2 ships, the Ehani and the Wari, arrived the following day and endeavored to pull her out to sea, but the Bacana refused to be moved. The master, Captain Richard Williams, then gave orders to abandon ship, and the crew and a few passengers were safely lowered into surfboats and taken ashore. The surfboat, which was carrying the captain to one of the other ships, capsized, and he was drowned. His body was recovered from the sea, and he was buried in the center of Harfasini, where, Although the gravestone has suffered by erosion, it is still possible to read most of the inscription. Captain Richard Williams, who perished in the surf August 28th, 1913, aged 40 years. Day dawns and the shadows flee away. I remember more vividly, however, the stories that had circulated about the cause of the shipwreck. How the god of the river Amazule, wishing to visit his goddess of the neighboring river Arianialuanu, had planned this disaster in order that he should have a boat at his command. The superstition surrounding this was strengthened by the fact that the Bacana was actually dragged nearer and nearer to the mouth of the river until eventually she reached its mouth, where she lies today, firmly embedded in the sand, a huge rusty shell, deserted by all but the surf that destroyed her. But majestic still in spite of her torn and broken masts and her gaping hull. In fact, the people of Harfacini still say that they see the lights of a ship, believed to be the Bacana, as she sets out to sea at night and plows her way to Arianialuanu. My mother confirms the fact that I was a small boy at the time, and that the event occurred some little time after she had brought me from Creful to live with my father in Harfacini. Assuming, therefore, that the year of my birth was 1909, the Saturday nearest to the middle of September in that year was the 18th. It seems likely, therefore, that I was born on Saturday, the 18th of September, 1909. On the day I was born, there was much celebration and beating of drums in the village of Creful. Not, I may say, in honor of my birth, but in connection with the funeral rites of my father's mother, who had died a short while before. As far as the Akan tribe, of which the Nzimas form a part, is concerned, funerals receive far greater honors than do births and marriages. The ceremonial rites performed for the dead presuppose the existence of a supernatural world, and, in order that they should not be deprived of comfort there, they are buried with gold, clothes, and other necessities of life. Continuous wailing is carried out by relatives and friends of the deceased person, and this goes on throughout the first few days. During the third week following the death, a ceremony of remembrance of all the deceased members of the clan is held, commencing with the offering of libations to the spirits and ending in the small hours of the morning with games, dancing, and feasting. And so, on that particular day in Creful, my birth was of very little interest to the villagers. I am told, however, that there was a good deal of commotion going on where I was, for I apparently took so long to show any signs of life that my mother had given up all interest in me, as she believed me to be dead. This is not as heartless as it may sound, for it is a strong belief among the Akans that if a mother mourns the death of her child, she will become sterile, and this, to an African woman, is the worst thing that can befall her. But my female relatives, having dragged themselves away from the funeral celebrations, would not give in so easily. They were determined to put life into me and proceeded to make as much noise as they could with cymbals and other instruments, at the same time jolting me about and even stuffing a banana into my mouth in an effort to make me cough and so draw breath. They finally succeeded in arousing my interest, and their job completed, handed me back to my anxious mother, a yelling and kicking Saturday's child. Great importance is attached by the Akans to the day of the week on which a child is born, for this determines his platonic soul. They believe that a man is possessed of three souls: the blood souls, or moiga, transmitted by the female and considered synonymous with the clan; the ntoro, which is transmitted by the male; and the okra, or the platonic soul. In order that there should be no mistake about the okra, a specific name is given to the child according to the day of the week on which he is born. A male child born on Sunday is called Kwesi. If born on Monday, he receives the name Kojer, and so on. For a boy born on Saturday, the name is Kwame. There are other superstitions surrounding a child's birth. For instance, the first child is supposed to be less bright, and the third child to be precocious and incorrigible, the 9th child to bring good luck and the 10th child to bring misfortune. Sometimes the fear of bad luck at the birth of a 10th child is so strong that the infant may be smothered at birth or during early infancy. Whilst I can claim to fall into the pattern of things by being born on a Saturday and bearing the name of Kwame, it is surely disheartening that I was the first and only child of my mother, and am therefore, according to tradition, less bright than average. Kroful is a typical West African village composed of mud and water houses and bamboo compounds. The ground is high and stony and leading down via a steep escarpment to a stream on the one side and to a swampy lake on the other. I lived there with my mother until I was nearly 3 years old, when we left to join my father, who was a goldsmith in Harfasini. Harfasini is about 50 miles from Kroful and is on the borders of the French Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast. It is unfortunate for Nzimas that the Teno River and the Ayi Lagoon into which it drains were taken to form the boundary between the two countries, for the people had set up fishing villages all around the lake and are now divided. This has caused much discontent because of customs authorities, language and other barriers which they encounter when crossing from one side to the other. Many of them still travel on foot the longer way around the seashore every day. Even today, it is a common sight to see women with the heaviest of loads on their heads set off at a trotting pace on their 7-hour journey. And when they arrive at their destination, they are still trotting. In these days, it is also quite a common thing to see lorries travelling by this route, but this can only be done when the tide is low. There were no lorries in the days of my childhood. Indeed, there were not even proper roads, and when I left Kroful with my mother, it was necessary to make the journey to Harfasini on foot, travelling through Esiyama and along the seashore. This took nearly 3 days, and we had to spend 2 nights in the villages en route. At other times, when we used to journey into the bush together, and we could not complete our journey in one day, we would sleep out in the open forest. I remember helping my mother to collect pieces of wood and dried leaves in order to make a fire to keep wild animals away. I had no fear of such things myself. Like all small children, I had complete confidence in my mother, and she was a most worthy and vigilant protector. Although she allowed me a lot of freedom and I never felt myself tied to her apron strings, she was always at hand when I needed her, and she had a knack of knowing my wants without either of us speaking a word. She never seemed to use her voice to command. There was something about her presence, her quiet, decisive movements, that placed her above most people and gave her a natural leadership. My father was a man of strong character, extremely kind and very proud of his children. Although I was probably one of the most willful and naughtiest of children, I can never remember his lifting a finger against me. As a matter of fact, I can only remember my mother beating me really hard on one occasion. That was when, because I couldn't get my own way about something, I spat into a pan of stew that was being prepared for the family meal. We were a large family, for although I was the only child of my mother and my father had quite a number of children by other wives whom he married by native custom. Polygamy was quite legal, and even today, it is quite in order for a man to have as many wives as he can afford. In fact, the more wives a man can keep, the greater is his social position. However unconventional and unsatisfactory this way of life may appear to those who are confirmed monogamists, and without in any way trying to defend my own sex, it is a frequently accepted fact that man is naturally polygamous. All the African has done is to recognize this fact and to legalize or to make socially acceptable a thing which has been done and will doubtless continue to be done by man as long as he exists. It is interesting to note that divorce in this polygamous community is negligible compared with countries practicing monogamy, especially when divorce can be obtained so much more easily than in a monogamous society. For a marriage can be brought to an end for any of the following reasons: adultery, barrenness or impotency, drunkenness, sexual incompatibility, the quarrelsome nature of the woman, inharmonious relationship with a mother-in-law, and discovery of marriage within one's own clan. All members of a clan are considered to be blood relations, and if a marriage takes place within two members, it is believed that the whole clan will be visited by the wrath of the gods. In my parents' case, for instance, both were of the same tribe, but my father was of the Asona clan, and my mother was from the Anonas. As hereditary is governed by the matrilineal line, I belong not to my father's clan, as would be the case in most Western marriages, but to my mother's. My father's line descends through the eldest son of his sister, a member of the Asona clan. Apart from our immediate family, which consisted of about 14 people in all, there always seemed to be relatives staying with us, and our little compound was usually full of people. It is a custom among Africans that any relative, however distant that relationship may be, can at any time arrive at your home and remain under your roof for as long as he wants. Nobody questions his arrival, how long he intends to stay, or his eventual departure. This hospitality is sometimes very much abused, for if one member of a family does well for himself, he usually finds his compound filled to capacity with men and women, all claiming some distant kinship and all prepared to live at his expense until the money runs out. My family lived together very peaceably, and I can remember very few quarrels. The women of the house used to take turns each week to cook the meals and look after my father, and at the same time, they either worked in the fields or did some petty trading in order to supplement the family income. It was a wonderful life for us children, with nothing to do but play around all day. Our playground was vast and varied, for we had the sea, the lagoon, and the frill of the unexplored bush all within easy reach. But we had no toys. I remember one of our playmates, whose father had made some money, one day produced a child's bicycle and was to be found daily pedaling it up and down the beach. We were extremely envious of him and longed to be allowed to ride it, but he was very possessive and rarely let the thing out of his sight. Today, however, it is he who may be envious of other people, for his father died and left the family not only penniless, but also quite unequipped to make their own living. It was probably this bicycle that inspired my half-brothers to build one of a sort of two iron hoops that they found. What I remember most about that incident is the way they treated me, almost as a mascot and something rather sacred. Although they all wanted to sit on the contraption and be the first to try it out, I was placed on the seat and held firmly in case I should come to harm. Looking back on the kindness and consideration with which they always treated me, I sometimes wonder whether they did not, in their heart of hearts, regard me as a spoilt little brat. Probably they were afraid that I would run home screaming to my mother, whom they held in high regard, that they were careful to give me no cause for complaint. Certainly my mother rarely denied me anything, and doubtless I took advantage of this. But I believe that she tried not to make her affection too obvious, because whenever she was serving our meals, she always gave me mine last. I insisted on sleeping in her bed until, of my own free will, I decided to join my half-brothers, and I remember how I used to be angry when my father came to sleep in our bed and I insisted on sleeping between them. Several times he tried to explain to me that he was married to my mother, but I told him that I was also married to her and it was my job to protect her. Unlike most growing children, I was very rarely ready for my food. In fact, my mother used to get worried because of the trouble she had in forcing me to eat. She discovered that I would sometimes wake up hungry in the night, and so she formed the habit of putting some baked plantain under my pillow, so that if I woke at any time through hunger, I could eat this and go back to sleep. I very rarely ate a meal during the day and only returned from my games in the evening to eat the food that had been prepared. My parents never complained about this, and once they realized that I was flourishing in spite of my small and irregular meals, they ceased to worry. Although there were plenty of children with whom I could play, my happiest hours were spent alone. I used to wander off on my own and spend hours on end quietly observing the birds and the lesser animals of the forest and listening to their numerous and varied calls. Sometimes, however, I was not content merely to sit and watch them. I wanted to touch and caress them. It was not long, therefore, before I devised a means of trapping them, not to kill, but to bring home as pets. Many times I returned with a squirrel, a bird, a rat, or a land crab. On one occasion, I remember refusing to go with my mother on a journey unless she allowed me to take a pet bird along with me. Clutching the small cage against my body, I suppose I either smothered the poor thing or else killed it with fright. Anyhow, we had not gone more than 5 miles when I suddenly discovered that my precious bird was dead. This caused me so much distress that my mother was unable to console me, and there was no alternative but to return home. I had heard many stories about ghosts, for such things are a very real part of tribal society. Instead of being afraid of these tales, however, I remember sitting for long enough on my own, wishing that I could die simply because I should then rank among those privileged souls who could pass through walls and closed doors, sit among groups of peoples unobserved, and make a general nuisance of themselves. I did not know whether this longing for things supernatural indicated psychic power, but my mother has many times related the following incident, which occurred one day when strapped to her back in the normal manner of a young African child. I was traveling with her on one of our frequent journeys together. It happened that she had to wade through a stream on the way, and as we neared the center, I suddenly cried out in excitement that I was standing on a fish. Although startled by my sudden and noisy outburst, my mother was even more surprised when she discovered to her utter amazement that she had actually trapped a fish with one of her feet. It ended happily, for she managed to catch it and we had it for dinner that evening. To strangers, I must have appeared a strange and difficult child. Few would have believed that the small boy who kept himself in the background with his finger in his mouth, or who would make himself scarce for hours on end, could, when roused, spit fire like a machine gun and use every limb and finger nail in defending his idea of justice. Two men in particular ran away from me in horror. The first was a policeman who, in the course of his duty, reprimanded one of my half-brothers for doing some kind of mischief on the beach. As he grabbed hold of my brother's arm, I was indignant and began to pound him with sand at such a rate and with such force that he let his victim go and ran away. He reported the matter to my father and I received a severe telling off, but I was sure I could detect a twinkle of amusement in my father's eyes. The second man was in love with one of my half-sisters and came to our compound to ask for her hand in marriage. At first, I did not understand who he was and what he had come for until in general excitement someone explained to me that he had come to take my sister away in marriage. I yelled and screamed like one was possessed and kicked at the poor lovesick man until he was forced to run from the compound. I soon learned, however, that life for a growing boy was not all play, at least not for boys with parents like mine. Although my mother had never had the benefit of a formal education herself, she was determined that I should be sent to school at the earliest opportunity. My father, probably due to my mother's persuasive power, was strongly in favor of this also. Even though I could often get around my father, I knew that once my mother's mind had been made up, there was nothing I could do about it. I found my first day at school so disappointing that I ran away determined never to return. But my mother turned a deaf ear to my raging protests and quietly but determinedly dragged me by the arm each morning and deposited me in the schoolroom. Eventually I realized that I had lost the battle and decided that I was going to be forced to stay there. I might as well try to get to like it and do what I could to learn something. To my surprise, I soon found that I enjoyed my lessons and looked forward to going to school, even though we lived in fear and trembling of the teacher because of his firm and active belief in the adage, spare the rod and spoil the child. I disliked being forced to do things against my will, for I had not been accustomed to it, and I used to think what a paradise school would be if we were left in peace to do our studies without the presence of the schoolmaster. All the various grades were housed in one room, and the master used to teach a class at a time. It must have been a hard job for him, and we did not do anything to ease his lot. Luckily, I was keen on learning, so keen in fact, that soon my only dread was that my father might one day be unable to afford the school fees, which at the time amounted to 3 pence a month. Because of this, I started rearing a few chickens which I sold for 6 pence each. By this means, I could not only help to meet the school fees, but I had money to buy books as well. In addition, any fears about my father's poverty were quite unfounded because I can never remember him denying any of us anything we asked, and he was particularly generous where I was concerned. One thing in particular stands out in my mind during my early school days, probably because it was my first lesson in discipline. We were not fond of the teacher because of his frequent use of the stick. Often we fought without just cause. One day, we learned that an inspector was coming to the school and immediately saw our chance of getting our revenge on the master. We got together and decided to play truant for the whole day during the inspector's visit. My one regret was that I was not able to see the expression on the inspector's face when he found an empty classroom, or better still, the look of horror and amazement on the face of the teacher. It must certainly have caused him much embarrassment. But the following morning he got the last laugh, for as soon as we showed our faces, he was waiting for us with his stick. We were each stripped naked and given 24 lashes on our bare bottoms. This hurt so much that for the next 3 days I was quite unable to sit down at my school desk. But whatever injury this caused to my body and my pride, I knew well enough that I had deserved it. And from that day I have always learned to accept punishment that I feel I have justly earned, however humiliating this may be. At about the same time, I came under the influence of a Roman Catholic priest, a German called George Fischer. This large and well-disciplined man seemed to take a liking to me, and he did much to help me in my studies. In fact, he became almost my guardian during the early school days, and so relieved my parents of most of the responsibility with regard to my primary education. My father was not at all religious when my mother was converted to the Catholic faith, and it was through her and Father Fisher that I was also baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. In those days, I took my religion seriously and was very often to be found serving at Mass. As I grew older, however, the strict discipline of Roman Catholicism stifled me. It was not that I became any less religious, but rather that I sought freedom in the worship of and communion with my God. For my God is a very personal God and can only be reached direct. I do not find the need of, in fact, I resent the intervention of a third party in such a personal matter. Today, I am a non-denominational Christian and a Marxist socialist, and I have not found any contradiction between the two. Probably it was the same fear that my aspirations might be held in check by the Roman Catholic Church that made me afraid of getting myself tied up with women. In those days, my fear of women was beyond all understanding. I remember there used to be a young girl who lived a short way from my home, and she used to wait for hours in a little lane dividing our compound from the next one. If I happened to come out into the lane, she used to approach me and try to start a conversation with me. When she saw that I simply stared at her like a frightened animal, she probably thought I was shy, and so she bravely whispered to me that she loved me. I was horrified and abused her as if she had hurt me. I rushed in and told my father, I rushed in and I told my mother of the wickedness of the girl. My mother laughed and said, "You should be flattened, my boy. What is wrong with somebody being fond of you?" The girl was persistent in her advances, and she started bringing tempting dishes of food, which she gave to my mother for me to eat. As soon as I knew that this girl had provided the food, I refused to eat any of it. It was days before my mother could persuade me to eat anything. I have never outgrown that feeling towards women. It is not fear today, but something deeper. Perhaps it is a dread of being trapped, of having my freedom taken away, or being in some way overpowered. And I have the same feelings about money and organized and obligatory religion. All three of them represent to my mind something that should play a very minor part in a man's life, for once one of them gets the upper hand, man becomes a slave and his personality is crushed. Perhaps if I had heeded the passionate words of the girl in the lane, I would have been content to spend the rest of my days with her in Harfacini, teaching at the local school or following in my father's trade. But things didn't work out that way. End of chapter 1.